Today, our topic is a crisis in local news. And this is really a timely topic from my point of view, because I noticed that the Washington Post columnist Margaret Sullivan was out yesterday with a new book called Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. And that is certainly not a new issue, but it continues to be a developing one. And we have an expert with us today to give us some context. Its lead story staff writer, Dean Miller. Dean has edited daily and weekly newspapers. He's worked as a reporter for more than a decade and is co-author of 2 nonfiction books. After a Harvard Nieman Fellowship, he served as director of the Stony Brook University Center for News Literacy for 6 years, and then as senior vice president for content at Connecticut Public Broadcasting. Most recently, he wrote a twice-weekly column for the Seattle Times called Save the Free Press. Dean, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to move fairly quickly. I talk kind of fast. I apologize for that, but I want to cover a lot of ground. It seems to me like we could do an industry snapshot in my year's work in local journalism. It's not all about me, but I think I'm sort of indicative of what's going on. So in July of last year, I was editor of the Port Townsend Leader, where I spent a lot of time working on public access to local documents and local government, training young journalists, and just survival of the paper. In February, I took the job at the Seattle Times as free press editor, doing a twice-a-week column about attempts to save the free press. That job was cut short in June, and I was hired a week later as a staff writer for Lead Stories, which is one of the contractors doing fact-checking for Facebook and other social media platforms. We spot things that are going viral, and we fact-check claims, publish those, and then Facebook attaches those. If you've posted something that's garbage, they attach a note to it to tell you and your followers that that has been checked for some problems in the fact realm. The other thing I'm doing is some contract work for the Institute for Nonprofit News, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But before we get started, I want to kind of start with the big picture. If you're ready, Reed, let's put up the slides.
Okay, let's see here. I'll just open this window and take me just a second, and okay. You should be seeing it pretty about now.
Beautiful. So a little thought experiment. What do you think? Could Henry Ford, who owned the Dearborn Independent, could he be stopped from publishing articles that claimed that the Jews were responsible for farmers' credit problems and bankruptcies in his time? Could he be stopped for saying that the Jews were going to cause people to take illegal actions? Could he be stopped from publishing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories? Say you were the news assignment editor for a national network, and you found out that, all these months we've been searching for Osama bin Laden, we had his satellite phone. We had tapped his satellite phone. We were listening to all those conversations. We knew what was going on, and nothing had been done. Could you be stopped from broadcasting that fact? As it turns out, you couldn't stop either of those things. Over the years, interpretation of the First Amendment has made it an article of faith for us that you cannot put any prior restraints on publication. And what people often forget is that while we have no prior restraints on publication in almost every area, except for a couple of exceptions, you are responsible for what you publish. So Ford couldn't be stopped from anti-Semitic rants, but certainly he bore the consequences of publishing those things, both reputational and business. The news networks, there was an argument made by the Bush administration that broadcasting the fact of that sat phone tap that we had would damage the national security, but it was unsuccessful. The courts have given wide latitude that the people should know And to be fair, the news media have been extraordinarily careful. You never hear about it, but they've been extraordinarily careful about not broadcasting everything they know. Next slide, please, sir. There's the Osama bin Laden slide. Then another one, please. And that's First Amendment, 5 freedoms, right? Which is religion, press, speech, assembly, and petition for the redress of grievances. Arguably the most powerful 45 words in our nation's history. Okay, next slide, please, Reed. Wow. James Madison was much more radical than we think, especially given the depiction in Hamilton. Madison was a real radical about free speech. Some degree of abuse is inseparable from the proper use of everything, and in no instance is that more true than in that of the free press. What kind of tightly rolled hemp was Madison's on his plantation that he thought that that was okay? But that was exactly where they landed. You have to remember the founders grew up under extreme tyranny of the nobility in England and elsewhere, and understood to their core that the only powerful antidote to that kind of tyranny was the ability of people to see, speak, and discuss the truth. Next slide, please. Key concept in constitutional law in Neer versus Minnesota, 1931 case. Scurrilous publisher of anti-Semitic and other articles, who was shut down as a nuisance under the nuisance ordinance. And Louis Brandeis laid down this idea that every man has a right to publish what he wishes, and if it be defamatory or libelous, suffer the consequences later. That is really radical stuff. You have to remember that our legacy that we inherited is really radical. You know, who doesn't think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? And yet this is the way our courts and our framers thought about free speech and the free press. Next slide, please. In the New York Times versus the US, which is the Pentagon Papers case, Potter Stewart said, look, in the absence of governmental checks and balances, the only effective restraint upon executive policy and power in the national defense and national affairs may lie in an enlightened citizenry, in an informed and critical public opinion, which alone can help protect the values of democratic government. That's a crazy idea. And as a journalist for 35 years, I've really resisted sort of the fourth estate idea, you know, that we were this powerful counterweight. And yet, as I started to study it when I was teaching at Stony Brook University, clearly this is the case, that the press was considered a really powerful fourth estate of our government. And the roots of that, next slide, please, Reed, are in Enlightenment philosophy. You know, Franklin was quoting the Areopagitica. Is that Pope? I think it's Pope. You know, this idea that, or it's Milton's Areopagitica, that printers are educated in the belief that when men differ, both sides ought equally to have the advantage of being heard by the public. And when truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter. We'll see if we think that's really how it works out this year. It's a really difficult year for the First Amendment and for the free press. So that's the big underpinnings that I wanted to nail down first. Reed, we can go off the slides now if that's okay with you. So today, literally, you're starting to see coverage of a Carnegie Mellon University study by the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. And they've been tracking bots, which repeat and spread viral mischief online, would be the kindest word to use.
So bot is short for robot. I think.
Yes.
And the idea is that there are these automated tools that will take some post or article and then repost it multiple times. So it looks like there are a lot of people talking about it.
Right. So things get a lot of traffic, they go viral. And in natural disasters and US and foreign elections, the Carnegie Mellon researchers find that robot involvement, automated reposting of material is normally between 10 and 20% of the traffic online. But in a new study, these researchers found that bots may account for between 45 and 60% of the Twitter accounts that are discussing COVID-19. Many of these bot accounts were created in February and have been amplifying and spreading misinformation about medical advice, the origin of the virus, and the reopening, the debate about what's reopening too fast, what's the right speed at which reopen. So 4 to 6 times as much activity this year, which is why the World Health Organization early on in the crisis declared that we were fighting at the same time as we were fighting a pandemic, we were fighting an infodemic. And so they have the World Health Organization, and I believe the CDC as well, have special web pages devoted to myth busting because there's so much garbage out there. So at this time of crisis, when newspaper online readership is off the charts, most people don't know that newspapers are in financial trouble. All newspapers except for 3, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today, which have national readership and got early into online subscriptions. And so the loss of advertising dollars during the pandemic has not hit them as hard. It's certainly hit them, but not as hard as their counterparts who rely on print advertising dollars still for the majority of their revenue. And if you look around the Puget Sound, you see signs of the trouble. McClatchy, which publishes the Tacoma News Tribune, the Olympia paper, the Bellingham Herald, and the Tri-Cities Herald, and owns 49% of the Seattle Times, is bankrupt. Just went through an auction this week. The hedge fund that was holding a lot of their debt, Chatham Financial Management, I think it's called, is apparently determined to sell McClatchy now to Alden Global, which is another hedge fund that owns a ton of papers. We'll talk about them later. Meanwhile, Sound Publishing, which publishes the Bainbridge Island Review and more than 40 other titles around the Puget Sound region, has undergone major furloughs, staff cuts, reductions in print days. Some of their print papers are coming back after the initial cut. They took an early move, but they are certainly in distress. Josh O'Connor, the president of Sound Publishing, in March was saying, we are in real peril of survival here at the Everett Herald, where he's also a publisher.
And Sound Publishing is actually owned not locally, right?
Right. Sound Publishing is owned by a Canadian conglomerate that is one of the biggest small paper publishers in Canada. They're involved in oil pipeline development. It's a big corporation owned by it's called Black Press, is the overall press part of that company. It's based out of British Columbia. So you've got Sound in our region, and then Gannett, which owns the, help me out, Reed.
What, the Kitsap Sun?
Yeah, Kitsap Sun. And they're in some trouble as well. You know, they've been cutting staff, cutting days. And then Spokane, which is a family-owned paper like the Seattle Times, has cut Saturday for the first time in 100 and some odd years. This is not new to just coronavirus. In the past 15 years, newspaper newsroom employment has dropped by 50%, 50. That's a study that's been ongoing by the Pew Research Center, which tracks an annual state of the media report on economic and other factors. 50% of the staff of newsrooms is cut. And if you look at like congressional and state house bureaus, they've been cut about 35% over the same period, which when you think about having no one guarding the chicken house, that's a little terrifying. So what? Newspapers screwed up. They blew it, in 1995 when they put all their content for free online. They, as an industry, we didn't innovate fast enough, blah, 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 blah. What I say to that is we were flying a jetliner and needed to change engines in mid-flight with a fully populated jetliner. And we actually did a pretty good job of innovation. And the fact that we're still in business at all is a testament to that. Most newspapers focus now almost entirely on digital publication. They still print on paper because there's good money in those circulars and other advertisements. But the companies are deeply focused on reaching people online and publishing in that way. And they have become digital powerhouses. And we'll talk about that. Let me talk about it now. So at this point in the American ecosystem of news, newspapers are 1/4 of the titles publishing. The other 75% are a little bit of radio, TV, and online outlets. Despite being 1/4 of the titles publishing online in the internet space, in the news space, newspapers produce 60%, 60, of the local original content. In other words, they set the agenda that radio and TV follow and that many online outlets follow. Newspaper newsrooms still do the lion's share of the local news work in the United States, even though they're but 1/4 of all the titles publishing. So what happens? Okay, but so what? Things change. Every industry has disruption. What happens when local newspapers die? Well, let me check my citation here. I believe it's Notre Dame Business School. Yeah. At the Notre Dame Business School, what we find is that borrowing costs for local governments rise in communities where a newspaper has died. We find that in communities where the newspaper has disappeared, like Seattle, a University of Oregon scholar, Portland State scholar found that civic engagement is reduced. So he studied towns like Seattle, where the PI died, and others, and found that even though civic engagement was slipping broadly, nationally a little bit, in those towns that had lost a newspaper, engagement slipped even more. So that's participation in committees, going to city council meetings, that kind of public involvement in democracy. There's also been a study that showed election competition slips in communities where newspapers disappear, which is troubling. You just don't have as many options when you go to vote for mayor or city council or county commission or whatever the elected positions are locally. So that's troubling. And in addition, people in communities where newspapers disappear, people tend to vote a much harder party line ticket, which some partisans may think is okay. But it is troubling that you don't have people crossing the ticket. That's the way I've always voted, is all over the ticket, and both parties. And you have less of that in communities where there's no coverage. So
basically, if there's not anybody there bringing these issues to the attention of the community forgets about it and ignores what's going on because there's no way to learn, or it's without attending all those meetings yourself.
Right. I mean, that's what I always used to say, is that newspapers don't have any special right. Newspaper reporters have no special rights, and they don't. A newspaper reporter is just somebody who's paid to do citizenship, right? They're paid to go to meetings and ask questions and find out what's going on and tell their friends. Only a journalist tells their friends, online or in an article. And that's a really important function that the founders protected in several ways. In addition to the First Amendment, newspapers had the cheapest distribution rate from the U.S. Postal Service, so that newspapers could be cheap and universal in reaching all citizens. And so there were a bunch of protections that the founders set up that have sort of disappeared over time, and now we're paying that price. So at the Hussman Center at the University of North Carolina, Penelope Muse Abernathy has been for 8 years now studying what's going on with American newspapers, and particularly focusing on what she calls news deserts, which are communities that have no newspaper. And now she's added another term, which is ghost newspapers. And those are communities where there's so little staff that it's just filled with fluff, and it's just a vehicle to carry real estate advertisements and insert ads. Since 2005, the United States has lost 2,100 newspapers. There are now 1,800 communities in the US that have no local newspaper, no local news outlet. And many of the country's remaining newspapers have become what she calls ghost newspapers. Despite the shrinking universe of surviving papers, the newspaper chains are bigger than ever. McClatchy, which owns these 4 papers in Washington, McClatchy got into trouble because they tried to grow into a conglomerate. They bought the Knight Ridder newspapers, and the debt just proved more than they could handle, and they ran out of cash reserves and cash flow and couldn't pay important things like their pension obligations. And so they sought bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11, and they've now been auctioned off and will be chopped into pieces or absorbed by another chain. The thing that's problematic is that in order to harvest the scale economies of being a big newspaper chain, you get rid of a lot of local staff. So Gannett owns the Ithaca, New York Journal, a city of 30,000 with 30,000 students. There is one journalist working in Ithaca for Gannett. And they fill the Ithaca Journal, I think it's called, the local paper, with content produced from centralized pods of journalists who serve all of the regional papers. So you get a couple of local stories from the local journalist, and you get a bunch of stories from a regional perspective, which can be really valuable. I don't want to completely diminish that, but it also is not local. You don't have that flavor. You don't have that content from across the street down the road. As of today, let me put my glasses back on. Gannett Corporation now owns 613 papers. Digital First owns 207, and Lee, which bought out Berkshire Hathaway's papers, owns 170. Those three corporations own, I think it's 15% of all U.S. papers. And when you look at dailies, it's a bigger percent. So, all right, this is troubling. We know that disappearance of papers is not great for democracy. We know that chain and conglomerate and hedge fund ownership reduces the localness of newspapers, which for us readers is not a great thing. For us citizens is not a great thing. And so what are the efforts that are being undertaken? Well, I was working on one at the Seattle Times, which is the Save the Free Press Project. And that's Mr. Blethen, the owner of the publisher of the Seattle Times. That's sort of a legacy project of his to try and create the circumstances to increase local ownership of newspapers, to get hedge funds out of the business, because their business model is not about community service. It's purely about maximizing cash flow. They buy papers expecting to hold them for 3 or 4 years and then either kill them or sell them. And so as long as if you're buying them for 3 or 4 times revenues, cash flow, then in 3 or 4 years, your investment has paid off and you're just harvesting straight into the bottom line. And Alden Global, for instance, has got a big real estate investing arm. And a big stock play arm. So they take the cash out of their newspaper business and use it to fund other investments. That really has no bearing, no value to local newspaper readers and citizens. So what are the efforts that are being taken to fix the problem? One of them is a little local effort by the Seattle Times. I worked for years at the Center for News Literacy, which was working on the demand side, trying to create news consumers who understood what fact-based journalism looked like and what garbage looked like, and hopefully would select the better stuff. There's a Free Press Action Fund that seeks to fund news startups in communities that need it. The American Journalism Project is working on the same thing. The Knight Foundation has a local journalism initiative. They're investing about $360 million in various efforts. The thing that's interesting me right now, because I'm working with the Institute for Nonprofit News, is that a lot of entrepreneurial types are starting these little local nonprofit online news operations. And I thought, that's never going to go anywhere. But the INN Index, which is their annual study of the health of that industry, is finding now that a majority of nonprofit news outlets, I think they looked at 500 of them. Yeah, that those outlets, for the first time, philanthropy is not their major funding source. Their major funding, they're getting individual giving. They're also getting people to pay for online subscriptions. And that's where I want to close, is whether you're looking at little local online news organizations or a giant like the Seattle Times, that online subscription you buy is incredibly important, because that helps fund the newsroom. Right now in the industry, sort of the driving metric is that your newsroom budget should be covered by the revenue from online subscriptions. And that's a secure model going forward. Then whatever advertising they sell, that's the gravy that pays for, the lease on your building, some of the other expenses. But really, we've pared down to the news consumer and the news creator is the prime relationship. And part of that is you keeping faith with that newsroom and saying, I value the news. Even the stuff I don't read, I want it to be done, whether it's accountability journalism or sports journalism. I want somebody watching these things, and I'll pay a monthly subscription to keep that alive. And at the Seattle Times, I know before I left, the online subscriber numbers had just jumped incredibly, 25% or something like that in 3 months, as people found great value in that. So that's me. That's 30 minutes, a little bit longer than what Reed asked for, but that's where I want to end, and maybe we'll do some questions.
Yeah, well, I know that there are a lot of efforts. I know that there are some small organizations. You talked about our local papers, which are owned by larger organizations, but there are startups. And I know that for a while on Bainbridge, we had a couple of women who were doing online news reporting here. That business sort of foundered at one point, but there are local blogs or websites that are starting up, and I guess that's the group that you're talking about with the nonprofit news or the INN.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you said we're seeing more of those coming around, which is sort of, it seems to me, a little bit more like the neighborhood publisher of our nation's founding.
It is. I mean, I think the consolidation of the news business was inevitable. There are real scale economies. If you can own one printing press and run it 4 times a day, instead of 4 companies owning 4 presses that run once a day, that's a huge savings. So the consolidation made sense, but as Google and Facebook started eating, and Craigslist started eating up the revenues for news companies, there was less and less available to fund local journalism. And so we've had to have a real rethinking of the scale question. And I don't know if a company like Gannett that's just eating the whole world, I don't know if they can end up with a solid news product funded in the way that they're trying to fund it. And so these little local startups may be an alternative. I think the jury's still out whether they're going to have the ability. Joining us on the call right now is Roger Plotho, who was my publisher in Idaho Falls at the Post Register. We found out that there had been a massive cover-up of a series of pedophile molesters in the local Boy Scouts organization. And not only did the courts hide that, the Scout organization hid it. They didn't even tell some kids' parents when those kids had been molested by this Scout leader. But then we had a local billionaire businessman who went after the paper and tried to claim that it was all false. And that took an incredible amount of business courage to keep publishing those stories in the face of those headwinds, the potential for an advertiser boycott, the potential for a reader boycott from people who did not want to know that. And yet it was incredibly important to the families of those kids. And over time, the community rallied around and the state changed some key pieces of legislation to stop protecting the pedophiles ahead of the Scouts or their victims, whether they're Scouts or not. And I worry that these little local websites, how are they going to have the reserves to carry out that kind of journalism? That's pretty tough.
I wonder if there are, I see things like, this is not a direct analogy, but I see that an organization like ProPublica is now partnering with news organizations to work together on investigative reporting. I wonder if there are ways that as we reconfigure the news business, there might be shared deep pockets of people who would be willing to support investigative journalism in all kinds of situations, and you could sort of share that part of the business rather than sharing the printing press.
Yeah, there is that. Can you buy group insurance for your employees? Can you buy as a group libel insurance? I was a witness in a case against Mother Jones by this billionaire dude that I was talking to you about. I think their insurance company said they spent $2 million defending what was ultimately a frivolous lawsuit, pure harassment. So a person with a lot of resources could drive a news outlet out of business, even if the news outlet has published the truth. It's a really difficult thing. I am very hopeful about these small local outlets, but I also think they have their limitations, and that's the crux right there. I was watching Filthy Rich, which is the documentary about Jeffrey Epstein, and Vanity Fair, huge magazine at the time, very profitable magazine, part of a huge chain, Condé Nast, and he still intimidated them in 2003 or 2008 out of publishing the truth about his predilection for minor girls. That's the case that seems like would be ultimately defensible, and yet a person with enough money and power can squelch publication. So it's, for investigative journalists, which is, who I've led and been for my career, there are some real problems ahead we've got to solve. But I think that the thirst for information is pretty strong. And so I think there eventually will be solutions. But in the meantime, we've got to really look at Facebook and Google's vacuuming up of all the profit out of the publishing space. You're not going to see Facebook and Google take on those kinds of stories and support them and run the risk of litigation. That's just not, it hasn't happened. There's no evidence that they'll do that. Quite the opposite, in fact.
So if anybody has a comment or question, you can open up your microphone. If you're on the phone, it's *6. Here's a question from Lynn. She says, it seems as if all news media has become more biased in creating a less well-informed populace. We've totally lost the element of honest public debate, whether in newspapers, radio, TV, the public square, or Congress. We also lost truth in advertising under Bush and continue to see a widening division, information vacuum, and apathy in our country. She's depending on the New York Times, Washington Post, which are a couple of those papers that are making it, as you said, to keep issues in the public space. Any comment on her comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think bias is in the eye of the beholder. I think there is more opinion out there now. You know, Fox News is treading in the footsteps of media from the beginning of our republic. There's always been that sort of opinion based publication. That's what all original newspapers were. They were party organs. It wasn't until Benjamin Day figured out mass publishing as a way to do non-biased journalism that we got this modern idea that newspapers should publish, should be honest brokers and let other people decide their opinions. But opinion's very cheap to produce, and it's very popular, and so you see a lot more of it. The other thing is, if you've not done it, I would strongly encourage everybody who's here to get on the Project Implicit website. It's a huge, very well peer-checked research tool that allows you to identify your biases on almost any subject, whether it's gender, sexuality, politics, guns, you know, vegan food, you name it. You do the quiz. And I think what it reflects is that we're not all horribly biased people, but we're the products of our environment. And we have certain implicit assumptions about the world. And when we read the media and we don't see those implicit assumptions affirmed, we say, that's bias. Well, it's not exactly right. It's more our bias being triggered by something we read. Certainly, there's some purely biased publication and broadcasting out there, but we also really get peevish about stuff we don't like. I mean, if I tell you right now that George Bush had a better GPA than John Kerry, a lot of hackles going up. Fact is, they both had terrible GPAs at Yale, and Bush's was a little better than Kerry's. That's a fact. Not a comfortable one for a lot of people, but you know what I'm saying? So there's stuff that we hear that we don't want it to be true, and yet it is. And we call it bias, but it's not. So bias is a really tricky subject, I will admit.
So the other thing that has changed in my lifetime anyway is are the restrictions or the guidelines for broadcast media around public opinion and obligation to inform. Yeah. Can you say anything about that?
Well, the fairness doctrine was washed out, and it used to require that on broadcast, the two sides were given fair play, and that's changed, and that sort of led to things like Fox News and other outlets. When I was teaching students, I said, the problem is there's not good labeling. A lot of people read opinion and watch opinion stuff and say, oh my God, that's so biased, that's terrible. It's supposed to be. It's what they're doing. The opinion shows, Hannity, Tucker Carlson, et cetera, those are not news broadcasters. Those are
opinion. Well, and Anderson Cooper, and I mean,
Well, yeah, Cooper has gone into that field as well. I mean, if you watch the main news show, Shepard Smith on Fox did an incredibly good job night after night of covering the news. And, ditto Chris Wallace, incredibly good, straight journalist who, stayed within sort of the Society of Professional Journalism guidelines. The problem is so many people watch these opinion shows and think of them as news shows, and they're not. It's not their function. But they're not well labeled either. And like Bill O'Reilly spent a lot of money marketing this idea that he was in the spin-free zone and that he was giving you the news. He wasn't. He was giving you his point of view very effectively, very powerfully, with a lot of the same tools as news, but that wasn't a news show. At the time, when they asked Fox about that, they said, look, our news shows are, I forget the hours, but it was like 8 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 6, or whatever. And a lot of people just totally missed that distinction. And I wish there was a national standard that had a little, screamer on the top of the screen that said, this is an opinion show and this is a news show. And then you could hold people to the standards that were appropriate to what was being produced.
One of the other challenges, I think, for local news is the tools. And a former boss of mine, Merrill Brown, is involved in a thing called the News Project. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's an effort with the Associated Press and WordPress and others to try to put together technology to make it easier for smaller operations to start up.
Yeah, honestly, it's been there for so long. Side note, I have almost no patience for university professors who complain that they only had 2 weeks to get ready for remote learning. When I was at Stony Brook 5 years ago, all the tools were available to do asynchronous and remote learning, and we used them. Some of us used them extensively, and some of our colleagues refused to learn them and refused to use them, and they were caught flat-footed. Those tools are all, I'm not a big Google fan, okay, but if you get on Google, you have all the tools you need to publish a newspaper right now online. All you need to do is grab a cheap WordPress
website
template, and you're off and running. And WordPress is in the middle of a really cool project to do not only the forward public-facing side of it, but the business side of it. If you're not aware of this, you should be. The whole goal of online business now is to move you along a conveyor belt from somebody who has hit a website to somebody who's returned to a website to somebody who's a routine user of the website to somebody who becomes a paid subscriber or a customer to somebody who becomes a brand advocate. That's the whole of modern business online in a nutshell. And the companies that use those tools well, like the Seattle Times, where more than 60% of their revenue is now from online subscribers, are doing that process constantly, bringing you along into the fold and tending to you pretty carefully. It's a better relationship than the print one was. And those tools are available and they're incredibly cheap. One other little side note I want to raise. What's being missed in all the focus on the deleterious effects of Facebook, Google, and Craigslist on local journalism is Amazon. Okay. If this pandemic settles down and we go back to regular life, Main Street will have been decimated. And Amazon will be basically Jabba the Hutt from the Star Wars movies, belching and chuckling and saying, because, during the pandemic, we all shopped online. Had to, kind of. We didn't go to local outlets to buy the things we needed. We went to Amazon, maybe Walmart, and Amazon is getting enormous and more control over the retail economy, and your Main Street stores are going to vanish in the near term. And again, that's a problem. I ask you this. Have you found any organization on Bainbridge Island that has received more than $65 from Amazon Smiles? From Amazon. And he's local, right? I think his mom lives on the island, in fact. Not sure about that. They don't give anything away. They're incredibly cheap about it. In fact, last time I looked at the numbers, the sum total of Amazon's giving would not fill one shelf in the Carnegie libraries with books. One shelf. Whereas Carnegie built these gorgeous libraries all over the country. Amazon's been incredibly cheap about their participation in local communities, and they do business in every zip code in the United States and much of the world. And there's been no pressure on that at all, which is a problem for everything. It's a problem for local journalism, but it's also a problem for local communities. They're a terrible citizen, in my. Other questions. Sheila Kerwin. Interesting that Shepard Smith is now to be on, is it CBS or is it MSNBC? I can't remember which, but yeah, Shepard Smith has been picked up by one of them.
It's CBS.
It is CBS? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for Shepard. He did a very difficult job and he did it well.
And you know, the thing about him that I appreciated was that he reported the news. He also did a little bit of snarky stuff, which made it opinionated. But I would say 75% of what he did was reporting. Yeah,
no, he was very straight on it. I have to say, there's a place for good conservative-oriented news outlet in this country. It's a really important thing because, let's see how to say this. The majority of news networks in the United States are based in Manhattan, right? Or Atlanta. They have a very city folks view of the world. They have the journalists have a very city folks experience of the world. It's very different from suburban and rural America. And I think that a conservative outlet that's stuck to Society of Professional Journalism standards would be incredibly valuable as a counterweight, you know, and I've always thought that. I mean, journalism pays terribly, which is part of the reason that so few Republicans become reporters. I was a rare guy in that I had worked in Republican politics before I became a journalist. And it was kind of fun, my whole young career, taking all this abuse from Republican politicians who had no idea who they were talking to.
One fact check here. AP reports it's CNBC.
Yes.
Where Shepard Smith is going to work. So too many letters there. That's
it's CNBC. So yeah, I mean, I think that a really great conservative news outlet would be a real service. Right now, they tend to be not conservative; they tend to be Trump driven, and so that's very different, at least from the Republican Party that I grew up very close to.
If you are interested in getting notes from this, send me an email at info@biseniorcenter.org. And Dean, if you have any links, I did put a link to the quiz that you suggested in the chat.
Good.
And if there are any other things that we might want to pass along, I will send them out in an email later today after this video is posted.
I'm glad to, all those studies that I cited, I've got the citations on a document, so I'll send that to Reed. And he can share that back to you so you can kind of take a look at what I'm, is that Miller guy spinning me or has he got some basis? So I'll send you the links to that stuff.
Okay, well, thanks for your spin-free zone today. Well, I guess it wasn't entirely. Jeff Bezos might complain about that a little bit, but
he might. Jeff Jabba the Hutt Bezos, you mean?
I am grateful for you spending the time with us, and I want to thank your mom for introducing us to each other. Carolyn is a member of the Senior Center, and if you aren't, you can be. It's just $20 a calendar year. And this is what we're doing during COVID, are these daily check-ins every day, Monday through Friday at 11:30. If you have an idea about somebody to invite, let me know, and we will call them up. Thanks, Dean.
Great. Thanks, Reed.